other end, you was gone.
And I think that's why you are in Comedy Central. Can you imagine if you were in real show business, where you'd be then? It's the Autobots!
There's a famous quote attributed to Albert Einstein about World War III, and you've probably heard it. I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. Mutually assured destruction is a military theory that was developed to deter the use of nuclear weapons. Neither side would attack the other with their nuclear weapons because both sides are guaranteed to be totally destroyed in the conflict. No one will go to all-out nuclear war because no side can win and no side can survive. For almost 80 years, this concept of mutually assured destruction has played at least a part in preventing regional conflicts and the desire for war from boiling over into full-blown nuclear conflict. This attempt at equilibrium between the superpowers may have delayed World War III, but its mere existence should still chill you to your bones. By definition, the consequences of using even one nuclear device in battle would presumably lead to the end of the human race as we know it. When I was younger, this threat was very real and on the minds of people, normal citizens, as they lived out their lives. But let me be very clear to those people who are too young to remember or are older and should know better. There is no such thing as a limited nuclear war. Once the first one is dropped or set off, there is very little hope of turning back. The scale of destruction, suffering, and death would be unparalleled in the history of our species. Anyone with an internet connection can quickly find out the approximate nuclear capabilities of not just the two superpowers, but now multiple superpowers, all nuclear armed, and all of them with their fingers on the button. In the aftermath of a nuclear conflict, if somehow we survive the initial blast, it is not hyperbole to say that I would prefer an instant death than to live in that world, covered in radiation. Death by radiation poisoning has been described as one of the worst ways to go. Furthermore, the world's food supply would be instantly decimated, as radiation would saturate the topsoil on every farm, anywhere near where the device went off. The subsequent distribution of radioactive soot into the atmosphere would plunge the Earth into a nuclear winter, of which the duration would be based on how many weapons were used. As a small reference, in 1883, the Krakatoa volcano was the cause of global cooling that lasted 2 years due to sulfate emissions. That was one volcano that most people have forgotten about. Normally someone would say, I'm not saying this to scare you. However, I am saying this, and I'd like to show you the motivation for this review, but also to maybe give you something to think about when you hear the war drums beating. Strap in, lads. This one's a doozy. Today I'm delivering the Doomsday double feature, 1990's By Dawn's Early Light and 1983's The Day After.
Will somebody give me a cigarette? A real cigarette!
If you don't remember these two movies, it may be because they both aired as TV movies, seeing only a limited theatrical release, if at all. By Dawn's Early Light and The Day After are really two movies about the same sort of event from two very different perspectives. Essentially, they're both stories about the consequences of full-blown nuclear war. From one perspective, By Dawn's Early Light focuses on a B-52 flight crew assigned to a mission to do the unthinkable, while the mechanism of government tries to recover, regroup, and stop the war before it gets any worse. The Day After, however, zooms in and focuses on the consequences a small group of people living in rural Kansas faces for being on the receiving end of a nuclear attack. Both movies really start off the same way. There's a bit about what life was like before the war, what people's normal lives are like, even the naivete that some people might show when talking about Armageddon. You get a little bit of this in By Dawn's Early Light, and then it really jumps into the action, so to speak. The Day After, however, spends a lot of time showing you the day-to-day lives of these rural Kansans? that in both movies, the war gets started by a regional event that escalates and cascades and builds up to a full-blown nuclear conflict. In By Dawn's Early Light, the inciting incident is a rogue nuclear missile fired from Turkey, which only later is discovered that the missile was not fired by the United States. That war started under false pretenses. And in The Day After, the cause is more of a traditional conflict between East and West Germany, which ramps up into a broader conflict. Then the missiles launch. Once the missiles start reaching their targets, American bombers take to the skies in By Dawn's Early Light. And in The Day After, a large group of our main characters, or who we thought were main characters, are wiped out. As I said earlier, these films are very similar in many ways. Both have the same themes about the human reaction to disaster and a very overt cautionary tale about the horrors of nuclear war. Both movies portray those who are in control, those who initially have their finger on the button, only as a series of events that are not revealed to the characters in these movies at the onset. Both of the inciting incidents occur off screen. We only hear about them through news broadcasts and the government reaction. Both of these movies paint a picture of a grand misunderstanding between two superpowers. Because even in these fictionalized worlds, it was too ridiculous, too fantastical, to imagine that anyone would trigger this sort of apocalypse on purpose. Both movies being made for television movies with limited budgets, as well as being shot in the 80s, really makes the dodgy special effects stand out like a sore thumb. And though I'm sure they did their best by using scale models and shooting scenes in close quarters to avoid having to show special effects, at times it is hard to ignore. In retrospect, I suppose I have to salute their creativity in the face of such limitations. Even back in the 1980s, seeing these movies for the first time, and when compared to theatrical movies, it was clear which shots were stock footage provided by the US government, which shots seemed focused on the actors that did not require special effects, and those scenes that relied on those special effects that did not age very well. But the special effects are not where the strengths of both movies lie. Both movies have very important messages, and excellent acting from actors that may not have been famous back then, but we are now familiar with. Those actors in both movies skillfully depict how quickly our society would crumble, and how our own individual humanity, or how much is left of it, determines how we deal with crisis. In the movie By Dawn's Early Light, you have a mix of actors that were famous, and probably are still well known today, depending on your age. James Earl Jones and Martin Landau could be considered the headliners, the biggest stars of this movie. However, there are several actors who turn in amazing performances who built careers on being character actors. Those actors are maybe not famous, but once you see them, you recognize them. Typically you say, oh, that's the guy from that TV show, or wasn't she in such and such movie? This is no reflection on their skills as actors, but I recognize most of these people because I'm a bit of a movie nerd, and you probably are too. But your casual moviegoer, and especially for someone who may be a bit younger, may not know these people, but I bet they recognize them from their other projects. Actors like Powers Booth, Rebecca De Mornay, Darren McGavin, Rip Torn, Jeffrey DeMunn, Peter McNichol, and Ken Jenkins. Oh yeah, I recognize that guy. He was in Ghostbusters 2. He was Vigo's friend.
He's Vigo! You're like the buzzing of flies to him!
Oh, Johnny, did you back the wrong horse? Will you hose him, please?
Hose him.
Okay, I just wanted an excuse to show this clip. In The Day After, you have the same dynamic with the actors. The biggest actor, or the main star, I suppose, would be Jason Robards, who built his career prior to this movie, but was still well known for his acting. But then you also have young John Lithgow, young Steve Guttenberg, John Cullum, and Bibi Besh. And if you're wondering who Bibi Besh is, she played Captain Kirk's, wife? Baby mama? In Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. In an interesting bit of trivia, The Day After was directed by Nicholas Meyer, who went on to direct Star Trek II. Well, I thought it was interesting. In both movies, we see how the structures of normal society quickly break down, and how quickly we go from being civilized individuals, members of a society, to being animals, fending for ourselves. Characters are put in situations where their values and integrity are put to the test almost immediately. In some situations, the way we hold on to our ideal version of ourselves is the way we keep ourselves alive. In other situations, as depicted in these movies, our integrity and our ethics are what get us killed. I would say the biggest conflict in both movies is not a nuclear one. It's not the one between the two superpowers. It's the conflict between Group A, who are fighting to keep things as normal and sane as possible given the circumstances, and Group B, who fall apart emotionally, putting themselves and others in danger. This includes those who violate their own ethics by resorting to murder and stealing in order to survive. Sitting here right now, we might say that those who stick to their ethics are the ones we should support. They're the ones that we hope we will be, God forbid we ever experience the apocalypse. Maybe we can rely on our training and our self-discipline to provide for and protect ourselves and our loved ones. It is depicted in both of these films that in some cases, not every case, those who stick to the aspiration that civility is the way things should be end up having a much longer and much more difficult battle to survive, sometimes unsuccessfully. Without giving too much away, I want to share an example from the day after. One of the characters, who I would say is one of the protagonists, struggles the entire movie with the people around him, his own family, who are falling apart emotionally and physically. For nearly the entire film, he's able to provide for and protect his family and himself. He keeps it together with the thinnest of threads. His ability to maintain control and protect his family is so tenuous that when someone comes there to help, someone like-minded like him, that wants to hunker down and protect themselves, he tries to turn them away, knowing that even though he needs the help, he can't introduce one more variable to his tiny society. And in one of the final scenes, he attends a meeting that plans the rebuilding of their town. How are they going to provide things like water and power? How are they going to provide food when everything's irradiated? He returns home from the meeting to find some looters approaching his house and confronts them. His final line is a tearful, "This is my home." He almost sounds exasperated that these looters don't understand what that means. He doesn't understand why they don't recognize what "this is my home" means to him, and assumes that everyone should know what that means. Because let's not forget, it hasn't been that long since life was normal, and these people would have called him neighbor. Without a response, and with almost no emotion, no remorse, the character is gunned down in front of his home. I thought a lot about this scene when I was younger, seeing it for the first time, and recently rewatching this movie. This scene is indicative of the main conflict in both of these films. The people who intend to cling on to some sort of civilization have a much more difficult struggle ahead of them, and I don't mean to imply that they're wrong. What I'm saying is I think the message in both of these movies is that if you want things a certain way, if you want to put the genie back in the bottle, if you want to keep your family unit together, protected and fed and taken care of, it's going to be tough and you're going to have to fight. In By Dawn's Early Light, the concept of military training is added to this struggle. Those characters with the most experience, with the most training, are able to maintain discipline within themselves for much longer than those who are younger, those less experienced, or those who question the validity and purpose of the training. The way it's depicted in By Dawn's Early Light, having discipline and training is like building a bridge. Once the bombs drop and society ends, the amount of training that people have extends that bridge, and while you're on the bridge, you have a much better chance of keeping it together and making rational decisions. Those who run out of bridge to build are essentially in free fall. There's a character in By Dawn's Early Light who almost immediately falls apart and quickly becomes a liability to those around him. His mind is not focused on the task at hand, but on those loved ones that might have died in the initial attack. His judgment and his ability to reason are almost immediately compromised. As a result, he falls into some sort of psychosis, which ends up getting himself and some of his crewmates killed. On the other hand, the commanding officer, the pilot, played by Powers Booth, has almost a religious dedication to his training. And personally, I have a lot of respect for that. But in this movie, his dedication to his orders, to the protocols he's been trained to follow, are the wrong decision. And his co-pilot, played by a young Rebecca De Mornay, convinces him that she is right, because of course she is. She convinces him that they shouldn't follow their orders, because now that the bombs have dropped, what's the point? She also argues that even though she's a pilot, a very well-trained co-pilot, of a nuclear-equipped B-52 bomber, that they shouldn't drop their bombs because she knows it's wrong. She seems to have an omnipresent understanding of the situation both inside the airplane, the White House, and the Kremlin. But I digress. Of course, she turns out to be correct because movie. And though I found her character a bit grating, they do set her up as a bit of a rebel early on, which leads to her questioning authority, questioning her orders, and speaking as the voice of morality in the end times. And because she is delivering the message of the movie, their actions lead to a series of events that ends up making By Dawn's Early Light have a slightly happier resolution than the ending of The Day After. I say it has a slightly happier ending than The Day After, but in both movies, the characters are what the French call le boned. Let's go over some differences between the two movies. The biggest difference is The Day After is much more explicit with its messaging. They really hit you over the head with the terror and the gruesomeness of living or trying to live after the bombs drop. The fact that ABC picked Lawrence, Kansas as a location was done intentionally to show there was no safe place in America, or the world for that matter, that would protect you from the effects of nuclear war. The Day After shows the horrible effects of radiation poisoning as the result of the naivete of people wandering into radioactive areas because they don't know what they're really dealing with or they're desperate enough to ignore it. According to IMDb, the filmmakers of ABC successfully transformed Lawrence into a nuclear wasteland for a few weeks, knocking out windows and storefronts downtown, placing burnt or overturned cars painted with clouds of black spray paint throughout the streets, and setting up giant tent cities and shanty towns down on the banks of the Kansas River, where the teeming homeless set up camp after the attack. Over 2,000 Lawrence residents, including many University of Kansas students, were used as extras and were paid $50 to shave their heads bald and act as if they were dying of radiation sickness. They were asked not to bathe during the aftermath scenes to add authenticity to the movie. The Day After plays more like a documentary, while By Dawn's Early Light is a bit more polished and a bit more Hollywood. The Day After intentionally showed the graphic results of the blast and the subsequent radiation. When production began, the nuclear attack scene in The Day After was longer and supposed to feature extremely graphic, yet scientifically accurate, shots of what happens to a human body during a nuclear blast. As they wanted people to understand what the horrors of nuclear war would be, you can imagine how gruesome they portrayed it. But ultimately, it was too graphic for ABC and they cut it out. Also cut down were images of radiation sickness, as well as graphic post-attack violence from survivors, such as food riots, looting, and general lawlessness, as authorities attempted to restore order. There was so much concern about how people would react to the movie that ABC set up a special 1-800 hotline to calm people down during the original airing. We might laugh at it now because the effects are a bit janky, and the acting is a bit over the top at times, but even now in 2022, I found this movie to be disturbing. On the other hand, in By Dawn's Early Light, you bounce around from the cockpit of the B-52 to Air Force One to the President as you watch these characters who are really on a different level when it comes to this crisis, who try to deal with this and try to stop it from getting worse. Unlike in The Day After, they're not on the ground dealing with radiation. They're not having their skin peel off from the blast. It's implied that a few characters have gone blind viewing the blast, and the President is suffering from internal trauma from the shockwave, but the movie lacks the graphic depiction that The Day After showed. By Dawn's Early Light is more like a good episode of Star Trek, not the new shit, but the classic original series or The Next Generation. After the initial attack, all of these characters have a role to play, whether or not to respond, and to what extent the response should be. There's a great debate between the characters as they try to convince each other of the best next step. And just like a classic episode of Star Trek, there are those who think we should reply with overwhelming force, while others want to pause and delay the responding attack in order to let the politicians negotiate a ceasefire. In the cockpit of the B-52, the same debate is being carried out between pilot and co-pilot. Powers Booth wants to move forward with his orders and carry out the bombing of Soviet targets, while Rebecca De Mornay does not. They make reference to the results of their PRPs. PRP stands for Personnel Reliability Program, which, at the time, was a psychological profile and evaluation process which military personnel who had responsibilities involving nuclear weapons were subjected to. This was a clever way to give background to why Powers Booth is so dedicated to his orders and why Rebecca De Mornay questions them. I believe both of these movies have a certain amount of importance, especially now. I hope we have not forgotten or have been encouraged to forget. It wasn't too long ago where this fear was real. Of the two, By Dawn's Early Light is a much more watchable movie. Jumping from location to location and seeing the debate happening between the different parties, I found this to be very interesting and far less gruesome and terrifying. Even for the characters who are for an overwhelming response, you can kind of see where they're coming from, even though you might not agree with them. And even with their character flaws, you see the reasons why they want that level of response, even if a rational person would come to a different conclusion. The Day After, however, is a much more grounded depiction of the consequences of nuclear war, graphically so. On their own, very few of the characters in The Day After are all that interesting, with the exception of maybe Jason Robards. But in that movie, it's the community and social response that drives the plot. Robards' portrayal of an aging small-town doctor, put into a situation beyond his understanding, but still wanting to help, is basically the heart of the movie. You watch this movie and you keep wanting some good news. You're waiting for a glimmer of hope, but it never really comes. The world has gotten so bad that even characters of the strongest will can't turn the situation around. Jason Robards, with all his medical skill, burns up what's left of his life in order to help as many people as possible. He starts off as a noble character. He tries to stay that way through the crisis, but in the end, even he has to make decisions that would shock him if the situation were different. The Day After is like a movie your teacher would show you in school to teach you about the horrors of nuclear war. The messaging is so much more overt than in By Dawn's Early Light. At different points in By Dawn's Early Light, certain cities are attacked as part of this chess game between the United States and the Soviet Union. News of these attacks are mentioned offhand, just as a matter of fact, while other characters debate on what type of response they should deliver. The increasing hostilities serves to ratchet up the tension and show the audience that there is a looming deadline and the stakes are getting higher. Like I said earlier, it's a much more macro view of the conflict than in The Day After. But with both movies together, you get a much better collection of viewpoints as this crisis unfolds. And that's part of the reason I wanted to review these movies together. They might lack the budgets and they lack special effects and the polish of a Hollywood theatrical movie, but the importance cannot be denied because the consequences are beyond imagination. I'm not a historian, which is clear. At the risk of oversimplifying things, and for the purposes of this video, let us consider that the Cold War could be divided into two parts, two eras. The threat of war and nuclear annihilation fluctuated during the Cold War, going from extremely high during events such as the Cuban Missile Crisis to slightly lower in the times in between these high-tension events. But for simplicity's sake, let's say in the first era, from the end of World War II in 1945 to sometime in the early 70s, that the threat of nuclear war was based on really two causes. Either one side would launch as some sort of military attack, or some madman, perhaps from a rogue nation, would start a chain of events that would lead to nuclear war. In the second era, humanity introduced a new threat, the threat of a technological event that would lead to a nuclear war. With both sides seeing improvements in computing power, we started relying on technology more and more for things such as early warning systems, threat projection systems, and even doomsday systems such as the Soviets' dead hand system, or what the Soviets called the perimeter system. The perimeter system was especially terrifying because it could be used even if all of the Soviet forces were wiped out and there was no one left, no human left, to launch a retaliatory strike against the United States. Once activated, Perimeter would launch a command rocket tipped with a radio warhead, broadcasting launch orders to nuclear silos. The rocket would fly across the entire length of the Soviet Union, broadcasting the signal to launch all the Soviet nuclear missile silos. It is unclear even today how effective a plan like this would be. What's even scarier is that it's unclear whether this program still exists today. Like you, I remember the duck and cover drills. I remember witnessing the push-pull between the two superpowers in countries all over the world. Imagine how hard it must have been to figure out which provocation merited which level of response. The reason I keep asking this question is because when I grew up, and I'm afraid even now, the responses the United States chose, or will choose in the future, would either deter our enemy, embolden them, or lead to our mutually assured destruction. To be clear, I'm the type of person that believes that weakness invites conflict. I also don't want to see the United States or any other countries seem cowardly in the face of an aggressor that happens to be nuclear armed. But the purpose of this video, and the two movies I just reviewed, hopefully serves as a reminder that if things get out of control and there is nuclear conflict, there will be no winners, only statistics. Thank you for watching. I know this is a controversial topic right now with world events being what they are, but please keep the comments below civil. Also, we've recently exceeded 300 subscribers to this channel, and I'd like to take the time to thank every single one of you. The last few reviews have been almost depressing, especially since there are echoes of these themes in our current events. I think I'll do a comedy next time, Lord knows I need it. By the way, a few housekeeping notes. Yeah, I'm sorry about the Santa Ana Pancho Villa mix-up in my Wild Bunch review. Duly noted. Since then, I've tried to be a bit more careful about my historical facts, but you know, mistakes happen. But yeah, wow, that video has really blown up. I would invite you to go watch some of my other reviews, especially my JFK or Untouchables review. I'm pretty happy with how those turned out. Anyway, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Well, bye.